the White House. A key meeting just wrapped as President Donald Trump pushes for an end to Russia's war on Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky making his third trip to the White House this year as he tries to convince President Trump that the way to force Russia to the negotiating table is to give more weapons to Ukraine.
President Trump has a big chance now to finish this war. And President Trump is really showed for the world that he can manage ceasefire in the Middle East. And that's why I hope that he will do this, and we will also have such big success. For Ukraine, it's a big chance. And I hope that President Trump can manage it.
The tone of this afternoon's meeting notably more positive than the Oval Office argument you might recall when we saw during Zelensky's first visit in February. President Trump today said that Zelensky will not join him when he meets Russian President Vladimir Putin in Hungary in the coming weeks. But fresh off a ceasefire deal in Gaza, Trump projected confidence that after more than 3.5 years of war, Putin is ready for peace.
I think that President Putin wants to end the war, or I wouldn't be talking this way. I think he wants to end the war. I spoke to him yesterday for 2.5 hours. We went through a lot of details. He wants to get it ended. I think that President Zelensky wants to get it ended. Now we have to get it done. I think we have a good chance. I think President Zelensky wants it done, and I think President Putin wants it done. Now all they have to do is get along a little bit.
All right, let's get off the sidelines and go into the arena. My panelists here, along with CNN's senior White House correspondent, Kristen Holmes. Kristen, let's kick it off with you. We saw Zelensky just a moment ago leave the White House. What are you hearing about how those talks went today?
Well, we're still trying to get some answers here. We know that it seems unlikely that he's going to get what he came here for. On Sunday of last week, President Trump was almost threatening Putin that he was going to give these Tomahawk missiles to Zelensky. But after their 2-hour phone call between Trump and Putin, it seems less and less likely. President Trump was asked a number of times directly whether or not he was going to give those long-range missiles to Ukraine, and he danced around the topic. He said he hoped the war would end without using those missiles. At one point, he said that the U.S. needed those missiles as well. And he had told me the day before that, of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin asked not to give those Tomahawk missiles over. So it appears that was part of their conversation as well. Now, when it came to this meeting in Hungary, here's what President Trump had to say.
I would say most likely it's going to be a double meeting. It'll be a double meeting, but we will have the President, Zelensky, in touch. There's a lot of bad blood with the two presidents, and I'm not speaking out of turn when I say it. It's a very difficult situation.
So he says double meeting there. It appears that he's talking about a bilateral meeting with just him and Russian President Vladimir Putin, but instead, of course, used the term double meeting, which is not one we hear very often, led to some confusion. But one thing to note here is that if it is just in fact what we believe it to be, which is Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Trump, what makes this any different than the meeting that we saw in Alaska? And President Trump tried to say that Alaska set the groundwork for this meeting. But remember what he wanted out of Alaska. He wanted a ceasefire, and if not a ceasefire, a sit down between Zelensky and Putin, neither of which happened. And when he continued to say over and over again that he believed Putin wanted peace and an end to the war, when he was asked why he believes that now, he couldn't really answer the question. And in fact, at one point, he admitted that perhaps he was being strung along by Russian President Vladimir Putin.
All right, Kristen Holmes, live for us from the White House. Thanks so much. And let's go now to CNN Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Matthew Chance in Moscow. Matthew, I know Moscow is watching this meeting very closely. How is the Kremlin reacting?
Yeah, they're watching it very closely, undoubtedly, but they're not reacting to it in public. Privately, though, I suspect they've been watching these events unfold, watching this performance in front of the media in the White House with a degree of satisfaction. I mean, look, President Trump made it pretty clear that Zelensky was not going to walk out of this meeting with Tomahawk cruise missiles. And for the most part, that's one of the reasons why President Putin staged what was effectively a 2.5-hour intervention last night, calling President Trump, basically explaining to him from the Russian point of view that cruise missiles, Tomahawks, would not have a major effect on the battlefield, but they would be seen as an escalation, and they would damage the relationship between Washington and Moscow, something that they know President Trump cares a great deal about. And so there's that aspect they'll be pleased with. I think they'll also be pretty satisfied with the idea that Trump seems very sure indeed that President Putin wants a deal, wants to end the war, wants to talk about peace, kind of holding out the prospect of a peace agreement or engagement about peace has proved to be a very effective strategy for the Kremlin in the past. It means that they can essentially delay increased US military action support of Ukraine, supplies of weapons and things like that. And so I think they're pretty happy with it. But as Kristen was saying, it's very difficult to see what has changed in this, what will have changed in the meeting that's coming up in 2 weeks or so from now in Budapest, that summit between Trump and Putin. From the summit in August in Alaska, I was in that room. I saw how President Trump rolled out the red carpet for Putin and got virtually nothing in return. There's been a few things changed. The military pressure on the battlefield on Russia has been stepped up. The economic pressure has increased perhaps a little bit as well. But publicly, at least, Putin has made no suggestion that he's prepared to compromise on his core military objectives. And so there's a real possibility that nothing's changed at all, and we'll be back where we were back in August at the end of the Budapest summit.
All right, we're going to dive into that a little bit further. Matthew Chance, thank you so much. I want to bring in former NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Wes Clark and Ambassador Richard Haass. He served in the George W. Bush administration. And also, I want to put on the left side of your screen, you'll see our Arena text chain. That's where we're sharing additional analysis from a few of our top reporters and contributors. General Clark, I want to just pick up what we were just talking about, and that is this upcoming meeting at some point in the future between President Trump and President Putin. As noted, after the meeting in Alaska, you only saw more aggression from Russia and Ukraine. What could come out of this potential meeting in Budapest?
I don't think much is likely to come out of it. I think it's part of the threefold strategy that Mr. Putin has, which is attack on the ground, demoralize Ukraine through deep strikes and the population, and then use diplomacy to stall assistance to Ukraine. Here, he's doing it right here on the Tomahawk missiles, and buy time for his military to work. But Pamela, the real issue is this: if President Putin stops the war, wants to stop the war, just stop the war. All he has to do is stop. He's the one who's refused a ceasefire. This is not like Israel and Hamas. This is much different. This is a war of choice undertaken by Mr. Putin. He could stop it at any time. Now, would Ukraine be willing to concede the permanent occupation of those territories? That's a legal issue and a political issue, but it's not a military issue. All Putin has to do is stop. And if he wants the war to stop, stop it. And that's what I hope President Trump will tell him.
And you heard President Trump say that he thinks that Putin wants peace. Ambassador Haass, have you seen any signals of that?
Well, everybody in history always says they want peace. The real question is on what terms. So whether President Putin, quote unquote, wants peace is essentially irrelevant. The question is he willing to accept peace where he doesn't achieve all of his goals? The answer is no, which is why he continues after 3.5 years of this phase of the war to continue to prosecute it against Ukraine. Look, there's something that's painfully familiar about all this, where the United States gets closer to the point where it's going to yet again enter a slightly different phase of its support for Ukraine. Not that Tomahawk missiles, a handful of them would be a game changer, but it would make some difference. General Clark would speak to it with great authority. It's also symbolically important. And once again, we're pulling back, if you will, from the brink at the request of Vladimir Putin. We've seen this movie before, and I wish I could say this time it's going to be different, but there's absolutely no reason to believe it's going to be different. And that's what's so frustrating about American policy. President Trump is right to want peace. He's right to press for it, but his own policy is undermining his own goal because he's not putting enough pressure on Vladimir Putin, who continues to believe that time is on his side. We need to persuade Putin that time is not on his side, that more war will not give him more results. But once again, delaying American support for Ukraine has the opposite effect.
So then, General Clark, do you think that President Trump should have committed to giving Ukraine those Tomahawk missiles as a way to put pressure on Russia? That, of course, is the argument that President Zelensky was making. What do you think?
I'm not a big fan of the Tomahawk missiles. I think that they won't make a decisive difference in the war. It is, as Richard said, it's a political move. If you give them 100 missiles, it may take 3 months before they're over there and ready to go. And then if you launch them one at a time, the Ukrainians have a long-range missile that's got about the same size warhead. Maybe it's not as sophisticated in terms of missing, penetrating through air defenses, but it's a political gesture. So if President Trump doesn't want to give the Tomahawks, fine. I'll give something else, more ATACMS, more 155 artillery ammunition, announce more Bradley fighting vehicles, put U.S. Manufacturing in there to assist the Ukrainians. There's a lot of things you do, and of course sanctions. But the big thing is military pressure. And if that's what brought Putin to the table, why not put it on? If President Trump thinks maybe it did bring Putin in, well, fine, do it.